I'll get started and tell a little story. I love to tell stories. A few years ago, a few of you might remember a little thing called the Deepwater Horizon, otherwise known as the Gulf spill. While the oil was spewing out of that, I literally walked across most of Mississippi, well, all of Mississippi, most of Alabama shoreline, and then down into Plaquemine Parish. And then just meeting people along the way, praying with them, engaging them. But after that, we did a national day of prayer for the oil spill, actually 3 days after it ended in Gulf Shores, Mississippi. And after we did the event, we were invited to go to a local Southern Baptist church right on the beach in Gulf Shores. And along with me was a staff member from the White House who gave a great Christian testimony. And then I spoke and the pastor spoke. But after the service was over, the worship was ended, these two plus 75 women came up to me, decked out in basic Southern Baptist tradition with their beautiful dresses on and hats on, and said to me, "I didn't know there were any Christians in the White House." That gives you a little bit about the culture that I work in every day and want to tell the story of how we can engage with them and make a difference. And I'd like to start out by saying that most of you have seen the work of Cook came out a couple months ago about the science. We all have known that before. Shortly there at the same time, the folks from the Yale Climate Project came out with a study on what the American public believes. And I know there are some here that would prefer the Yale data that says 90% of America believes in climate change. I don't see that. I'm more aligned with the Yale data and the University of Maryland data that says there's a really disconnect between people about who believe in climate change, neither know or don't know about anthropogenic climate change. And I'd like to tell you that a lot of those people that don't know are identified as conservative America. And just to give you a landscape, in the world right now, about 26% of America, 27% are evangelical Christians. 24% are Roman Catholic. And the rest of the religious landscape is laid out before you. But just last year, no surprise, 80% of evangelicals voted Republican. White Catholics, 60% did. Now, if you put in the Hispanic Catholic vote, it's a different story. But talking about white America and Catholics. And those are pretty good trims. And what I'd like to tell you, and my whole premise for this, is if we're going to build a national consensus around climate change, we're going to have to think about ways that value these conservative American faith voters, who engage them where they're at, how they think, and then to institute change based on reaching them at their current value levels and moving forward. The typical messaging that's been around for 20 years on climate change, for those who have been following it, is first, it's a future threat. We've seen that a lot. You know, by the year 2100, we're not going to have Norfolk, or the temperatures are going to be at 4 degrees plus. Well, interesting thing. There's also, as we saw from the last slide, there's been this incredible message of denying the climate deniers by just proving the science. I mean, if you get enough scientists on board, you know, everybody will conclude that this is the right scientific consensus and the problem's answered. And of course, one of the great things is we have to have a national policy, something that's going to address it from the systemic level of who we are as a country. Well, unfortunately, conservative America, especially conservative faith community, holds a different set of values. And we have to understand those values if we're really going to institute change. Believe it or not, in conservative America, especially evangelical community, science is not a big thing. I happen to have an undergraduate degree in geochemistry, so I'm sort of a rarity. But, you know, I used to date rocks when I was in college, so that's my standard joke, and I did do that. Potassium argon is who I dated, but that's okay. But it's interesting is while science isn't a primary value, medicine and healthcare is. Think about that as we dialect. Certainly, as we all have known for the past years, government, especially big government, is not a priority either. An ongoing study that's happening right now, and I can't reveal the names to you, but it's a leading evangelical group and a leading scientific affiliation, is doing a whole series of roundtables around the country. And one of the things that they're really stressing is asking this question is, what is climate change? And for the majority of evangelicals, climate change is not a scientific issue. It's a liberal political agenda issue. So how do we do that? In fact, before we get there, I think the big government, the science, and not valuing those things has really fed into the denial movement. It really helps it. You may have seen or heard about something called Resisting the Green Dragon, put out by a fellow evangelical who calls people like me green dragons based on the dragon out of the book of Revelation of being the evil one. So environmentalists are evil green dragons. I simply tell people that I'm the jolly green giant. Hence why I wore mostly green today. I actually do that when I'm talking to conservative crowds, is to sort of have fun with this idea that I'm not evil, that I'm doing my values. Because that policy has fed into it, and we've seen it, whether you're conservative theological or you're conservative just in other ways, the ongoing debate has done that. So what do we do about it? So we need to talk about conservative values and how we get there. First, faith is a key value. And believe it or not, the Christian tradition is very much concerned with caring for what we call God's creation. In fact, the slogan we use as an organization is creation care. That's the Christian term for environmentalism, is a matter of life. We as evangelicals put everything in terms of human life. Because while we helped save the Endangered Species Act 20 years ago, more people will connect on with terms of human health and life. And so we intentionally use that slogan to connect. And by the way, if you ever see someone who's an evangelical and really would put up that there's a fight about it, remember this name, and if you've been around long enough, Francis Schaeffer was a theologian who died back in the 80s. In 1972, as a way to bring Christians on board with the greening movement, he wrote a profound text called Pollution and the Death of Man, primarily looking at environmental toxins and human life. And it's written, for those of you who know my thing, written with the King James Bible, extremely interesting theological argument that really puts to claim anything about those who are saying that the earth is going to be destroyed and don't worry about it and we can abuse and do anything about it, that we're called to dominate the earth. And we can talk about those and have those theological conversations, but that's a good place. Our family is also very important. So what happens to my family, especially my immediate family, is key to doing this. And I know this is probably pretty shakeful in here, but talking about pro-life. I was mentioning this morning at breakfast that I am probably the only person in this room that's number one, a Republican, and number two, who believes in pro-life. So I'm really a minority in this room. Talk about a little bit of diversity. Children's health is also, again, part of the family and key to who we're doing with. And believe it or not, and I know this is somewhat controversial, but Buell and others back in 2012 made this statement, which I find to be very true, is that conservatives listen to their political leaders. If Republicans right now take an anti-environmental vote, it affirms conservatives in their belief. And if Republicans take a stance that is affirming environmental action, they generally follow suit. Kind of interesting lead. In fact, I'd like to give you an example that's not environmental from a few years ago to talk about that. How many of you remember and know that President George W. Bush probably did more internationally for AIDS, at least starting the ball rolling, than any other American president? In fact, he was one of the people that changed the dialogue on AIDS from being a gay issue into being a matter of international health. Does anybody know where he got the strength to do that? It was from this gentleman, Rich Stearns. who leads the largest evangelical Christian relief and development organization, World Vision. Rich was a former corporate executive, answered the call to become president of World Vision, and 4 years before the president came out with that statement, he went and took a wild step for the evangelical world. If you think about the 80s, especially in early 90s, there was a lot of real bashing about AIDS around the world, and especially in the United States in my community. Rich made the statement that it was a children's issue and changed the life of the world. And that's the kind of change I think we can think of today and want to work with. In fact, I use that analogy of AIDS. 2 of my team members just came back from Malawi, led a trip of evangelicals there, something we're very proud of. It's kind of nice to send the young kids on a trip around the world instead of me. But it's interesting, this is a direct quote from Vincent, works for Tear Fund, a relief and development agency headquartered in the UK. And I love this. Nearly 1 million Malawians are affected by HIV/AIDS. But as he states, all 15 million Malawians are affected by climate change. And it helps build the moral argument for where we're going and what we need to do. And we have to transform conservative America. And I think there's a way we do it. We have to talk about who, why, what, and lastly, hope. And for conservative America, a lot of what I'm going to share with you now may not be confirmed scientific information, but I have personally made over 300 dialogues and conservative all around the country into conservative theological groups, and my staff another 100. And all this data is sort of our practice of how we've actually conveyed the message and changed and allowed people to be changed. The first thing you start with any talk of climate change or any environmental is who is impacted. It's not a matter of what or how, it's the who, it's people. It's telling those stories of people that are there and what happens, health impacts. And just another quick aside, how many of you have heard last year something called the Mercury and Air Toxic Standard? Quite a few people around the room did. We were able to take on that issue and turn it into an issue involving children's health, especially unborn health, and we were credited by changing enough conservatives to get that now as a matter of law in the United States. If you asked anybody in Washington, D.C., why we have a reduction in mercury from coal-fired power plants, they will say it was the evangelical community that carried the day, because we reframed the issue in a way that was understood and important, and therefore we're able to buy-in and get grassroots support. And it does have to be, first off, when you message to my community, you need to talk local. And I think there's some things there first that we just talked about, and you'll see some studies. Mays Nesbitt Hatch talked about in a paper last year about this, looking at how do you get people involved. And the first thing is there has to be a sense of doing it, and I'll move back here, has to be a sense of being engaged locally first. And as we heard yesterday from Jenny, and I think about it, is that that's not the only thing. You want to know that local children are being impacted, local people are being impacted, your neighbors are being impacted locally. One of the great statistics that's there is because of sea level rise, everybody around here knows of some little thing called Sandy. Quantitatively, 50,000 New Yorkers more were impacted because of sea level rise and climate change than just the storm itself. Real number, real statistic based on sea level rise. 50,000 people in one storm is a way to concern about your neighbors and rebuilding it. But it also has to be about international, about conveying. That's how the AIDS victory was won. That's why we went to Malawi. Christians, especially evangelical Christians, because of their missionary heritage, have turned that into a tremendous care about reaching beyond themselves. That's why the largest relief and development organizations in the world are primarily Christian-based, or started that way. World Vision, World Relief, World Hope, Tear Fund, the list goes on and on. And this is a really neat, convincing story. Jonathan Merritt, and I'd invite you to look him up. Jonathan Merritt's father used to be president of the Southern Baptist Convention. Jonathan is an ordained Southern Baptist. His father pastors a megachurch in Georgia. And he just went with us on this trip to Malawi. And, you know, Jonathan was always there. He actually wrote a book called Green Like God. But he's standing in a riverbed which changed everybody's life in Malawi that 10 years ago had fish in it and was the ordinary and was a source of protein for most of the village. And now it only runs with an occasional rainstorm. So we talked about who is impacted, and we're going to go back to herd health and keep going through that. And extreme weather is a good mention and violation, and future generations are a good thing to talk about, but not the lead. It's secondary to reaching people. So now we're going to get through why. And this is where you start telling stories. You can ask people about what's the weather like in their own community. I can talk to my 87-year-old dad around the table. One of the greatest disappointments my parents ever had was when I left the local church pastor to become an activist, especially on climate change. You got to be kidding me. But just this year, sitting at the table about 11 o'clock at night when my mother was facing an illness, my dad sat there and said, you know, winters around here aren't anything like they used to be. We used to have snow on the ground for months. You know, I think what you've been telling me about this climate change is really true. And it's listening to people's own stories, to engage them where they're at. And then you can talk about the science, but the science can't be a talking head. The science has to be a dialogue where people exchange ideas and they answer their questions and not just sound bites. And I'm going to move through this further, and you can see me at lunch. In fact, I will say that one of the greatest ways, if you want to get conservatives to be really funny about climate change, is talk about a scientist in the old Soviet Union back in the 60s. His name is, if I can pronounce it right, Mikhail, and I think it's Boinovich. He actually proposed to Nikita Khrushchev in the early 60s that Russia should put as many coal-fired power plants as they could in Siberia, because that would heat up and introduce carbon into it and make Kansas and Oklahoma and Nebraska deserts. And so the whole food production in the world would come to Siberia. True story. They didn't do it, but the science was right. And don't do like some members of Congress did, is, you know, don't pick every tornado and say it's from climate change. Be accurate and truthful. The worst thing you can do in my community is go off on a hyperbole and be caught that you're wrong. So what to do, and here's the critical thing. It does begin with personal empowerment. And I'm going to speed through this, and you can ask me to prepare for future. People need to know that they can do something. I've heard over and over again, we don't want it to be government alone. We are going to need government action, but we still have to have personal engagement. After a presentation, I had an Iowa corn farmer completely change his farming practices to sequester carbon by ground cover, because he could do something, and I was the first person that he ever heard say, you can do something about it. You can handle it. Stewardship is standard Christian values. Energy prosperity, it's a way to empower the developing world with electricity that's either green or sustainable, and will never reach the Millennial Development Goals without having it. So we do have the America can-do spirit, and I'm flowing because I'm really running out of time. But why we need, and we have to get to the point of needing some type of policy action. According to PricewaterhouseCoopers, and then from now, right now, until 2050, we have to reach a carbon efficiency of 5% a year. We have never done that as a country since World War II. But that's a great example from a conservative America. But we need an all-America idea to bring it together. We need to do it. So we can follow the lead of American businesses and American ingenuity, and I'm speeding up to get done here, and we can ask other questions on energy efficiency, research, flood insurance, cost-effective foreign aid. There is a great bill before Congress right now about energy efficiency, which actually might come through, and we certainly believe in a price in carbon. And lastly, you need to talk about hope. If you tell people that there's nothing they can do, or they can believe that there's nothing they can do about it, we've already lost. For us in the Christian tradition, We believe that all things are possible with God's help. Others may have a different thing, but the idea of hope has to permeate everything you can do. We have to work together. And I guess my concluding thoughts is this, is that we'll never be able to reach a consensus on addressing climate change without hearing the evangelical and conservative voices and having them be part of it. Otherwise, we'll continue to have a disconnect. But the final story I'd like to leave you with, and I know my time's up, is that you also need to have a messenger that's authentic to the community. A couple years ago, I was meeting with some people from the South and actually helping with a thing called the Restore Act, which took care of the Gulf oil spill. And they invited me, a gentleman who led a denomination of about 300 Jesus-only churches, which I don't have time to unpack, in Batesville, Mississippi, which, by the way, is the home of caskets for the United States. More caskets are made in Batesville, Mississippi than any place else. And before he gave me the formal invitation, he asked me a question. Have you received the second blessing? And I immediately said, of course. And if you don't know what the second blessing is, you're probably not a Pentecostal in our tradition, and know that that's being baptized by the Holy Spirit in one who speaks in tongues. I did not have any credibility with that audience unless I had received something that was very important to them. So the message and the messenger are extremely important for ways to transform conservative audiences to deal with climate change. And it can be done, and it is working. But we have to get away from just preaching to the choir and be inclusive. Thank you very much.